Next person on the list, also representing APC, is the former military head of state, Major General Muhammadu Buhari. He is 71 years old and his first wife passed away in 2006. He's presently married to one wife and now has 7 children. Now, I found out so many things about Buhari that I'm hoping that you guys will bear with me. It's a lot. Now, before Muhammadu Buhari took over power, Shagari's administration was known for extreme corruption, waste of resources, mismanagement, and lack of sanitation. Corruption was celebrated at that time, just like it is today, and we were having religious and political violence. Now, Buhari took over power in a military coup on December 31st of 1983, and he was in power for less than 2 years. Now, here are some good things that Buhari did. Him and his chief of general staff of the time, Tunde Idiagbon, originally from Ilorin, Kwara State, both of them, they arrested so many corrupt politicians. In fact, I heard that they arrested hundreds of corrupt officials and they put them all in prison. Many ministers were convicted in military courts and jailed. Everybody that had questionable wealth at that time became afraid to show it off because there was zero tolerance for corruption. Buhari also launched the famous war against indiscipline, which means zero tolerance for indiscipline in Nigeria. So it became a crime at that time for people to rush into buses. If anybody tried to rush in the bus, soldiers would be there to beat them up. So people were forced to start lining up. Nigerians became orderly. Nobody could cut lines, even in banks. So everything became first come, first serve. It's not a matter of who you know. And everybody obeyed the traffic laws. No one was allowed to drive on the wrong side of the road. Students were forbidden from cheating. Sellers were prevented from suddenly raising the price of commodity in order to make quick gain. Showing up late for work was no longer accepted. Everyone was getting to work on time. In fact, neglecting your children also became a crime at that time. Buhari and Idiagbon also introduced the famous environmental sanitation, so it became a crime to litter in public places and all the parks had to be clean. It paid up all our debt. Nigeria had no debt whatsoever. In fact, during his time, inflation rate came down from 23% to 5%. The Nigerian naira was so strong at that time. Also, drug trafficking was minimal during Buhari's time because Buhari was actually executing drug dealers. Now, before becoming the head of state, from 1976 to 78, he was the petroleum minister under President Obasanjo. Buhari was also the head of the NNPC when it was first created. At that time, Buhari built 3 oil refineries, one in Port Harcourt, one in Warri, and one in Kaduna. Nigeria was refining our own oil. We were not exporting our oil to refine, and we were exporting fuel. Buhari also masterminded the construction of 20 oil depots throughout Nigeria, laying over 3,200 kilometers of pipelines. Also, during Abacha's time, Buhari was appointed as the chairman of the Petroleum Trust Development Fund, controlling billions of dollars excess fund, and to his credit, the PTF was managed with transparency. For the years that it existed, PTF published its annual report on time, and they always addressed press conferences to respond to issues that are arising from the reports. And during that time, Buhari used the excess funds to construct roads all across Nigeria. I found out that in the 4 years that he was in charge of PTF, they constructed more roads all across Nigeria than the Nigerian government has constructed in the last 15 years. Now, the PTF under Buhari also supplied textbooks and learning materials for students nationwide, and they supplied drugs for hospitals. And lastly, they rehabilitated our mass transit system, supplying public buses. Buhari was the one that discovered the late Professor Dora Akunyili, and he was actually the one that nominated her for her position in NAFDAC. Also, Buhari was the first head of state or president to put women in cabinet. Buhari is the only Nigerian former head of state or former president with no foreign bank account that we know of, and also the only one with no assets abroad. Well, Goodluck Jonathan said he doesn't have foreign bank account, but no one has really investigated that. Buhari also has one house in Kaduna and one in his hometown. He doesn't have any house in Abuja or any land. He has no oil rigs and currently lives on pension. As a matter of fact, he wasn't getting paid when he worked as the head of the Petroleum Development Trust Fund because he was already getting his pension at that time, so he refused, which is why he couldn't even afford the 27 million naira presidential nomination fund. He had to take a loan from the bank. Now, Buhari has never been convicted of any crime, despite the fact that various tribunals had been set up by Obasanjo and by by Babangida to investigate Buhari, yet he's never been convicted of embezzling 1 naira. Of course, people accuse Buhari of stealing money, but none of them have been able to prove it. Oh, one other thing, when Buhari was the head of state, he stood up against the West when they were trying to meddle in our business. The IMF and the World Bank pressured Buhari to devalue naira because naira was really strong at that time. It was already 1 naira to $2. In fact, at that time, Nigerians were able to spend naira when they go outside Nigeria. So they felt that naira would be competing with the dollar and other major currencies. And they didn't like that, especially coming from an African country. So they also told Buhari that he should borrow money from the IMF. But Buhari refused. Instead, he focused on paying off our debt. So the IMF and the World Bank cut Nigeria from World Trade Organization. So Buhari resorted to trade by barter. We were giving oil in exchange for goods from Brazil, from Austria, Canada, France, Germany, anybody that would trade with us. So Western interests actually were the ones that sponsored Babangida to overthrow Buhari and devalue naira. Naira went down like suddenly. Of course, Babangida cooperated because Buhari was about to retire him, from what I found out, because Babangida had allegedly been involved in some drug-related issues. Now, let's talk about some not-so-good things about Buhari. When Buhari was jailing corrupt officials, he also jailed some people that were actually innocent. They were later released, but many people were thrown in prison before they were proven whether guilty or not guilty. Also, because Buhari sentenced some drug dealers to death, a lot of people found that as extreme. In fact, some people say that Buhari is crazy and radical. Also, there was a time that Buhari hired an Israeli to kidnap Umaru Diko. That's one of the most corrupt officials during Shehu Shagari's time. And he escaped to the UK when Buhari took over power. Buhari had him kidnapped in the UK. He hired an Israeli. They kidnapped him and they put him in coma. And then they hid him in a suitcase. They were bringing him back to Nigeria to serve jail time in a suitcase, and then they got busted at the airport. So yeah, Buhari can be crazy. Also, Buhari jailed some journalists under what they call Decree 4. He announced at that time that any journalists that write articles that they could not back up with evidence will be jailed, and he jailed some journalists for about 4 months. His argument was that he was trying to prevent libel. And of course, you know, jailing journalists is always a human rights violation. Also, when he awarded contracts to build roads when he was the head of PTF, he awarded those contracts allegedly mainly to his friends. Another issue is that many people were saying that most of the roads were constructed in northern Nigeria. Also, when he was the head of state, he stopped the Lagos railway construction at that time, and his argument is that Nigeria was borrowing money to do this construction and that he needed to stop all the borrowing and think about how to pay the debt first. Also, people say that Buhari is stubborn. I say, heck yeah, he is. I mean, this man has contested for presidency 3 consecutive times already, and this is his 4th time? Yeah, he must be really stubborn. Now, some people are also saying that Buhari is too strict. He's too disciplined. So a lot of corrupt people don't want him to run again because they're saying he may get rid of them. And you know, he is really strict. In fact, there was a time that he went abroad for a military training. He was sponsored at that time by the Nigerian government. And when he came back to Nigeria, he returned the remnant of his stipend. And don't forget that when Babangida took over power, he put Buhari in prison for about 3.5 years. And when Buhari came out of the prison, he found out that his wife had been collecting financial support from Babangida while Buhari was away. And guess what he did? He divorced her. The woman passed away in 2006, but he divorced her because he felt like she had compromised. So there are speculations among so many Christians that Buhari is a Muslim fanatic and that he wants to Islamize Nigeria. This to me is a misconception because Babangida was actually the one that made Nigeria a member of the OIC. That's the Organization of Islamic Conference. When Buhari was the head of state, religion was never an issue. Again, I'm not campaigning for Buhari, but I'm just trying to address that issue of Islamizing Nigeria. There was no religious violence during Buhari's time, not even once. Him and his vice president at that time, Idi Agbon, they were both Muslims, yet they did not Islamize Nigeria. He actually had a Christian running mate in 2011, that was Pastor Tunde Bakari, and I know that his personal driver of 10 years is a Christian, as well as his cook.